Rumbling, the deafening sound of horseshoes filled people's eardrums, and the small gravel on the ground was jumping slightly. A knight in a gorgeous armor was holding a blood-stained spear, and the corpse provoked by the tip of the spear was thrown onto the river beach. In the afterglow of the setting sun, the ruby on his chest was as bright as the blood on the spear, like a of war. This moment, he heard the sound of the galloping war horse, and raised his head slightly in surprise, as if he was caught off guard. It turned out that the two parties in the fight were already exhausted. A group of heavy cavalry in black armor rushed directly into the battlefield like a shot of a crossbow arrow. Came in an instant. Blast in an instant, the screams of killing and screaming resounded across the river beach, accompanied by the sound of knives piercing into the flesh and war horses breaking their bones. The head of the heavy cavalry is a black-armored knight who is as majestic as a mountain. Wearing a visor, he could not see his face clearly, only a pair of eyes burning with raging anger and yellowish teeth could be seen vaguely from the gap in the visor. Every soldier approaching him could feel his anger, and then ran away, avoiding it. At the end of the battle, this team of heavily armed cavalry rushed in and directly shattered all the morale of the other side of the war. As the arrow of the cone-shaped formation, the Black Knight wore a helmet with antlers on his head and waved a giant mace that was difficult for even 2 or 3 adult men to lift, and rammed directly into the Chinese army banner of the Royal Army. He was about to tear the man under the banner of the Royal Army into pieces. It was the knight wearing a gorgeous armor and a shining ruby on his chest. He is the commander of the Royal Army and the prince of the Targaryen family. Rhaegar Targaryen. He raped and kidnapped his fiancée. This is also the cause of this rebellious war that began in 281 years of the Aegon calendar. Because of the cruel reign of the Mad King Iris II, in the 283th year of the Aegon calendar, the rebellion has escalated and swept across the entire Westeros continent. The 7 countries and 4 countries of the Targaryen dynasty raised their anti-flags, and the valleys, stormlands, northern borders and rivers formed a powerful alliance against the Iron Throne. And the Black Knight Robert Baratheon, relying on the blood of his grandmother, Lele, the daughter of Aegon V, became the leader of the rebellion and openly competed for the throne. Now, after a long time fighting on the battlefield, Prince Rhaegar, who was brave and fearless, was also exhausted. Silver hair clings to his handsome cheeks with sweat, and his dark purple eyes turned into perseverance again after being astonished. Prince Targaryen held a spear in one hand, and drew a saber from his waist with the other hand. Undaunted to meet the opponent's challenge, the commander of the War Vortex Center launched a Oneonon single battle. However, when the heavy mace in Robert's hand was raised high, all the results were already doomed. Blast! The powerful impact knocked Rhaegar Targaryen from his horse to the ground. The long sword in his hand pierced through the gap in the armor and pierced Robert's thigh accurately, but the mace in Robert's hand also slammed into Rhaegar's chest, and the gorgeous breastplate collapsed. The broken rubies were scattered on the beach of the Trident River, carrying the noble blood of the Targaryen royal family, reflecting the mysterious light in the brilliant sun. The soldiers on both sides who were already exhausted saw this scene, and even stopped the fight, put down the weapons in their hands, and rushed to the river beach to the broken ruby shards. Toot, accompanied by the long and desolate horn on the battlefield, the rebel army launched the final attack, and the royal army was completely defeated and fled in all directions. The Battle of the Trident River is over. The bad news came back soon. Step on. The sound of hurried footsteps sounded everywhere in the Red Fort, and the waiters whispered in the corner of the corridor. King Iris Targaryen too was sitting on the Iron Throne and furious. Although he had received a secret report yesterday, he still directly ordered the soldiers who came to report the battle to be burned alive at this time, and he loudly rebuked the opponent for lying about the military situation. Bad intentions. However, in addition to the smell of burnt human flesh, the air in the throne room is still filled with a heavy breath. All the imperial ministers understood what Prince Rhaegar's death in battle and the defeat of the main royal army meant at this time. Although Iris is called crazy by the world, after all, as the ruler of the 7 kingdoms, he has a clear mind. After the rage, his face was still blue, and the back of his shriveled hands violently clung to the armrest of the Iron Throne. Then Iris seemed to have finally made up his mind, turned his head and looked at the young Yulan standing behind him and shouted in a low voice. "Jaime!" The tall and brazen blonde knight standing behind the king was slightly startled when he heard the king's name calling him, and then hurriedly walked to the side of the Iron Throne, leaning forward with one hand and holding the sword. "Wow!" The white armor rubbed and made a sound. "Your Majesty!" He did not expect that His Majesty the King would suddenly activate him. As the youngest member of the Royal Forest Guard, James Lannister has always been one of the transparent people. Reading www.yuyuganshu.com. He even knew that King Iris II did not allow himself to join Yulan because of his bravery and loyalty, but only to contain and humiliate his father. However, he forgot that the Royal Forest Guards of Iris II have followed Prince Riga to participate in the counterinsurgency war, except for him. Now His Majesty Iris is the only one available in front of him. Although Iris didn't like these blonde Lannisters, he could only calm down his emotions at this time, because he still needed to count on James' father, the Western Army of the Duke of Kian City, to come and quell the rebellion. The white-robed knight stood on the side of the Iron Throne with his sword bowed and listened to the low voice of His Majesty the King. The young face was slightly tense. He couldn't think that things had come to this point. Although Prince Riga died in the Battle of the Trident River, and the scale of the war began to tilt in a bad direction, the Targaryen family still had great power. Especially with his father, the Western Territory Army that is always ready to go, it is not easy for the rebels to break through King's Landing. However, he did not expect that His Majesty had already begun to prepare to retreat. "Hurry up!" While James was stunned, the man sitting on the Iron Throne had obviously lost control of his emotions. A pair of gloomy eyes locked on the young Yulan with a dangerous light, as if he wanted to see through his heart. James rolled his throat slightly, then immediately stood up straight and took a step back. The armor made a noise. He will not forget that Iris too likes to burn alive people who do not obey orders. "Yes, Your Majesty." Then walked quickly from the passage behind the Iron Throne to the depths of the Red Fort. "Convey the King's order." "Step on." There was a sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the house, and a figure walked to the door of a spacious bedroom on the second floor of the tower. The door of the bedroom was concealed, and a tiny candle light was faintly visible from it. A small figure was sitting at the round table in the bedroom, with one hand resting on his cheek, and long silver hair covering his ears, like a gem. The shaking candle light reflected in the crystal-clear purple eyes. He is Viserys Targaryen, the second son of His Majesty Iris II. He is only 7 years old this year. Viserys, who was naturally active recently, didn't know why he always stared at the candlelight in a daze, and took the initiative to shut himself up in the room to read the book he had bored the most. This situation has been going on for several days. The wrinkles on the face of the old maid standing outside the bedroom were slightly piled up, and worries were wiped out in a pair of dim eyes. As an old servant who has served the Targaryen family for several generations, she is very worried about whether Viserys will have mental problems like his father, the Mad King. After all, every Targaryen is born, the gods will throw a coin to decide whether he is great or crazy. However, the old maid's gaze did not awaken Viserys, who was in a daze. Half of his handsome cheeks were immersed in the darkness, and he was wearing the prince's gorgeous costumes. One hand was placed on the heavy parchment book. Thinking about his past and present life. His Royal Highness Prince. The old maid helped on the edge of the door frame and knocked on the door twice, then spoke softly. Her voice is not loud, but it is especially clear in the quiet mage building. And the Prince of Targaryen shivered like a frightened bird, and suddenly woke up, with a pair of light purple eyes looking at the maid standing on the edge of the door frame with a slight panic. Paused for a second. Then he remembered that he was His Royal Highness. After all, there was no one else in the bedroom, and this old maid seemed to be called Sophia based on the chaotic memory in his brain. "What's the matter?" Viserys saw the figure of the old maid in his field of vision, and then shook his head slightly, throwing all the messy thoughts behind his head, and looking at the other side earnestly. "Your Majesty, the Queen is looking for you." Was wearing a dark waiter's costume and a grey headscarf. Seeing that the prince was awake, the wrinkles on the maid's forehead were slightly unfolded, and then he spoke. "Mother." Viserys was slightly startled, his heart shook, but he closed the parchment book in his hand pretending to be calm, and slid off the chair. Judging from the chaotic memory in his mind, his current mother seems to be named Laila Targaryen, a gentle and kind woman who has been working hard to protect Viserys from his mentally disturbed father. Hurt. However, Viserys has been trying his best to avoid meeting with his mother. After all, his mother is the closest person to him, and he is afraid of revealing any flaws in any way. So I kept shutting myself in the bedroom and reading. One is to learn more knowledge, and the other is to avoid meeting with Layla. But he did not expect his mother would suddenly look for him at this moment. I see. Viserys' face is slightly tight, and he tries to show his composure. In fact, his acting skills are also impeccable. Almost no one can see the flaws. Even if he sees it, just a 7-year-old boy will not think of other aspects. Go. Then Viserys stood in front of the silver mirror in the bedroom, and the maid stood behind him to tidy up his clothes. You must be courteous to meet the queen, even if Viserys is her biological son. The etiquette of the nobility and the court has almost been engraved in Viserys' memory and even muscles. Viserys glanced at the maid behind him who was tidying up his clothes, and found that everything was the same, then retracted his gaze and looked at the silver mirror in front of him. A cloud of black mist gradually spread. Weselis Targaryen Dailiness, 3 soil, 5 water-based, 8 monthly, 18. These words are all displayed in the simple, high-level Valyrian language. As the survivors of the Valyrian civilization, the Targaryen family is actually not their native language in Westeros, the higher Valyrian is. Every Targaryen has been taught Valyrian and dragon language as a child. These solar and lunar properties can also be translated into the sun, soil, water droplets, and moon. But in front of me. Business as usual. Viserys was not surprised, because he had discovered this black fog a few days ago. As long as he stares at any reflective object for 3 seconds, this thick black mist will appear. Of course he has tried more items. Mirrors, colored glazes, gems and even dagger capitals can appear, but the dim stone wooden table will not appear. And he has also tried many times that other people can't see this black mist. He alone is a special existence, just like this world full of mysterious powers, and it's completely indescribable. Maybe this is also some kind of magic. Viserys was puzzled, but he did not find the answer after reading the books these few days. And he also gradually figured out the meaning of these cumbersome nouns. What they reflected was the current physical condition of Viserys. Sunator represents strength, earth nature represents heaviness, that is, physique, while water is supple, representing his agility and flexibility, and moon nature represents his will, or a more mysterious spiritual power. The data of a normal adult male should be between 810. He does not rule out that there will be stronger people. As for why Viserys's data is so weird today, perhaps it has something to do with his current age of only 7, and his body has not yet fully developed. But agility and flexibility are real. In his memory, Viserys alone can make several Red Fort guards stomping their feet but can't catch them. Monthly. 18. Viserys looked at the silver mirror and blinked slightly. This is far beyond the abilities of ordinary people, and may be related to his own special features. Perhaps he is a unique existence in this world. However, his super-mental power did give Viserys some preferential treatment, and his memory was different from ordinary people's. Excellent. Hiding in the bedroom to read a book these few days, he doesn't say that a lot of knowledge that needs to be remembered is unforgettable, but he will remember it deeply after reading it twice. And stay up late at night or feel sleepy. His Royal Highness has something on his mind. And the old maid who was tidying Viserys' clothes has been watching the expression on Prince Targaryen's face. She saw that the boy's lavender eyes looked strangely absent when looking at the silver mirror. Yu reading www.yuyugonshu.com seemed to be out of focus. Then pursed his lips, looking worried. No. Thank you for your concern, Sophia. And Viserys heard the old maid's words and shook his head slightly and said, "This seems to be the first time your highness has said thank you." The old woman wrapped in a turban slightly covered her mouth, looking a little surprised, while the expression on Viserys's face stiffened a bit, and her mouth opened, as if speechless for a while. There was silence in the bedroom of His Royal Highness Prince. After a long silence, Viserys cleared up his emotions and took the initiative to break the quiet atmosphere, and the old maid also just packed up Viserys' clothes. "So, did your mother say that she was looking for me for any reason?" Viserys pretended to be casual, but asked slightly tentatively. And the old maid was silent for a while. Of course she knew the reason. The Targaryen royal army was defeated, and the news of Prince Rhaegar's death had already spread in the Red Fort, and even the whole King's Landing was in panic. If nothing happens to the boy in front of him, he will become Viserys Targaryen III in the future. However, all this is based on the fact that Targaryen can still defend the Iron Throne, otherwise it is waiting for the fate of Viserys. Will be extremely cruel. Viserys looked at the old maid expectantly, hoping to get a little word out of her mouth. But in the end Viserys was expecting disappointment. The old maid wrapped in a grey turban wrinkled and sighed, then calmly shook her head. No. Soon. The old maid took Viserys down the mega tower and came to the ballroom on the first floor. This ballroom in Mage building is mainly used for royal banquets and dance parties, and it can accommodate more than 100 people. Sunlight came through the arched windows, shining on the silver mirrors in the ballroom, rows of lit candles swayed gently, and the whole ballroom was brightly lit. There is a long corridor on the second floor of ballroom. The thick walls are also hung with gorgeous wood carvings and exquisitely crafted brocade silks. On both sides, three-headed dragon flags symbolizing the Targaryen family are hung on both sides of the gate. The entire Mage Tower is actually a castle in a castle. It is located in the very center of the Red Fort. It has a wall and a moat up to 12 feet thick. As a royal residence, its defense capabilities are naturally unbreakable. And Viserys went to the ballroom behind the old maid, and found that there were already a lot of guards gathered here, all of them sorting out their outfits and weapons. Viserys and the old maid walked in and caught their attention, but they only took a look, and then they continued to work on their own affairs. His Royal Highness Prince, a middle-aged man with grey-black hair and leather armor and breeches, was also wiping the long sword in his hand. He saw Viserys walking in and nodded slightly and greeted him. And another Yuan-Tiwei wearing a white robe heard the sound and turned his head to look at Viserys. Locked by the gazes of the two knights, Viserys slightly squeezed his 5 fingers under his sleeves, but he was still very calm on the surface and greeted politely. "Hello. Sir William." Sir William Derry is the instructor in the Red Fort. He is mainly responsible for training the fighting skills and arrays of the guards in the Red Fort. He is also very good at fighting, otherwise he would not hold such an important position. And his elder brother is Sir John Derry in the Royal Forest Iron Guard, and he has participated in the counterinsurgency war with Prince Rhaegar. After the Battle of the Trident River, life and death are now unknown. Then Viserys turned his head and looked at the very young Royal Forest Guard, nodded and said hello. "Sir James." And the white-robed knight had no words. He held the hilt of the sword around his waist with one hand, and looked at Viserys's figure strangely. Is walking past him. Although he has only joined the Royal Forest Tiwei for a short time, he is not very familiar with the members of the Targaryen family, especially this second prince. But after all, they all live in the Red Fort. On weekdays, they don't look up. He always feels that there is something strange about Viserys today. It seems that the back is straighter, but the attitude is a little more humble. James shook the hilt with his 5 fingers, then his eyes turned to other places. And Viserys ignored the gazes of everyone looking at him. Although his heartbeat has accelerated a bit at this moment, he seems to have found some state. The more difficult he is, the more resilient he will remain. This is a characteristic that he has in his previous and present lives. Viserys came to the seat in the hall. Sitting on the seat was a gorgeously dressed silver-haired woman. He did not look up, but bowed slightly to salute. Mother. The atmosphere in the ballroom is still serious, but he doesn't know what happened. Weselis. Then, a tired voice rang from the top of Veselis's head. Queen Leela stretched out her hand across the boy's waist, hugged her son gently, and then leaned her head on his side face. My child. There is something terrible to tell you. Viserys could clearly feel that his mother's body was trembling slightly, and the strong woman in this voice had actually reached the climax of collapse. The velvet clothes are full of redness, bites and scratches. These are the marks left by her crazy husband in the bedroom when the bad news came last night, but Laila Targaryen, a strong woman, is still there. Persevere hard. Although the death of the eldest son, the news of the country's precarious situation, made her grief, coupled with the trauma of the soul and body suffered last night, for the sake of Viserys and the child in her womb, she must cheer up again. Fortunately, her husband still retains a trace of reason in his madness, knowing that the general situation may be irreversible, and eagerly ordered a team of Red Fort guards to be deployed to Queen Lila and his second son Viserys to Longshea Island. And Iris too himself is staying at King's Landing and preparing to fight the enemy to the death. He will never hand over the capital to the rebels in its entirety. He will fight the betrayers to the death. Because the rebels are not far from King's Landing. Although there has been news from the Raven, the king's friend Tywin Lannister, the Duke of Kian City, has decided to start the king. But after all, everything is still inconclusive, so the right way is to take the lead in escorting the queen and prince away from the right and wrong place like King's Landing. While the heavily armed soldiers were guarded by the left and right sides, and Queen Layla, who was already inconvenient walking with the maid, boarded the carriage, then pulled down the tent, and sealed it tightly. And Viserys followed his mother, preparing to board the second carriage. Yu reading www.yuuganshu.cm. And at this moment, an episode suddenly happened in the team. A little brown-haired girl did not know where she ran out. The guarding soldier didn't know the inside story, so she turned a blind eye to this girl. And Sir William, as the team commander, hesitated slightly, then sighed, and finally chose to remain silent as well. The little brown-haired girl ran to the front of Viserys' car, pulled his clothes up with her cute face, and seemed to be asking where they were going and why not take her with her. Let's go. Viserys recognized who this girl was from his memory, but he hesitated a little now, and clenched his fists. He knows well that he hasn't even figured out the situation very clearly now, and rationally speaking, he shouldn't be out of line. But the silver-haired boy gritted his teeth and finally hesitated, then stretched out his hand and pulled the little girl up, leading her directly into the carriage. Then a little black cat running from behind also easily jumped to the roof of the carriage. Hey! Balerion! The little girl in the carriage screamed in excitement, and then Viserys covered her mouth. The boy in the carriage looked out of the carriage nervously, then closed the curtains again, and whispered in her ear. Hey! Be quiet first, Rhaenys! Finally! Gurululu. As the wheels rolled on the stone road, horseshoes lightly stepped on the ground and made a sound. The knights held the weapons in their hands tightly, and a team escorted two carriages and hurriedly opened the door. Left the red fort and ran into the distance. And before Viserys pulled Rhaenys into the carriage, he turned his head slightly and glanced in the direction behind him. He saw a woman holding a child in an open window above Meg. Brown hair, black eyes, and her delicate body swayed slightly in the wind. She held a baby in her arms. Viserys knew that she was the wife of his cheap brother, his sister-in-law Ilya Martell, the Princess of Dorne, and her nephew Aegon Targaryen was in her arms. However, his brain is dizzy now, and he insists on accepting the situation of fleeing when he just came into this world, holding the little girl in his arms to let her not be too active. He has no time to think about why his father wanted Ilya and her pair of children in King's Landing. Obviously they have a chance to escape with themselves. However, the rebels are approaching the city, and staying in King's Landing means danger. Viserys also took a temporary risk and decided to take Rhaenys away at the moment before the team set off. He didn't even know if his father would send troops to chase them back. Or his small move to change history, flapping the wings of a butterfly, what will happen in the future. But now he has only tried a little bit, at least in his conscience. If the golden robe chased him later and had to force Rene Ribbon away, maybe he didn't have the courage to stand up and stop it. Set off. And Ilya, who was standing upstairs in Mage, saw her daughter got into Viseless carriage by chance and finally left the Red Fort. Her sickly body shook slightly, and then her eyes were slightly red with crystal tears across the cheek. She has a hunch that this will be a farewell to her daughter. Because the sea is not very flat nowadays, the storm has gradually risen in recent days. The team that escorted the Queen and the Prince could go straight to Dragonstone Island by boat in King's Landing, but after Sir William's deliberation, they finally chose to go on land to minimize the sea trip. And the king burned to death the soldiers who sent the bad news and did not prevent the leak of the news. The Red Fort had long been riddled with holes. Today's King's Landing has spread the news that the main force of the royal family was defeated and Rhaegar Targaryen died in battle. The rebels are threatening King's Landing aggressively. For a while, this big city with more than 1 million people fell into panic, the people were panicked, and the cloud of war was shrouded in the sky over King's Landing. Escorted team set out from the Red Fort and passed through the Aegon High Hill, along the way with heavily armed soldiers to disperse the chaotic crowd. And there is no sign of the Targaryen family on the carriage, and the curtains are hanging down, and it is impossible to see which noble person is sitting in the carriage. Go away! The soldier urged the horse to disperse the pedestrians on the street, and the whip in his hand swung down mercilessly. Snap! The noisy and chaotic crowd suddenly became orderly under the whip, and the ghosts were rushed to both sides of the road and made way for the convoy. Queen Layla's carriage was the first one, followed by Veseli's and Rhaenys' carriage. The boy opened a little gap with his fingers and saw the scenery outside. The carriage shuttled through the narrow streets surrounded by soldiers. From here, you could see a hill overlooking King's Landing in the distance, Targaryen. The dragon's den where the family used to raise dragons is on it. Rhaenys Hill's over there. Viserys sitting in the carriage had to find a topic to distract the little girl in order to appease the excited Rhaenys who thought she was going out for an outing. And this landmark with the same name as her is undoubtedly the best topic between the two little guys. Sure enough, the brown-haired girl held her little black cat Beleriand in her arms and looked over expectantly. However, she was disappointed that this hill was not built for her by her father who loved her. Viserys racked his brains to recall the knowledge he had seen from the history books during this period. Fortunately, he still had the ability to remember. Then told the little girl the story of Aegon, the ancestral conqueror, and his sister and little Queen Rhaenys, which happened more than 200 years ago. This Rhaenys Hills was named after the queen's husband, Aegon Targaryen, in memory of his sister who died in battle, and built a memorial church, but this church was due to the riots were destroyed and replaced by the Dragon's Den. The little brown-haired girl held the kitten in her arms and listened with gusto. She couldn't help crying when she heard the last news that the queen of the same name had fallen into a dragon and died in battle. I will also find such a husband who loves me in the future. Weselis. Rhaenys' eyes were a little flushed, and she sobbed lightly, as if she had already substituted into it, connecting her destiny with the little queen. After all, two people with the same name and surname, it is easy to have sympathy and association. Coupled with the innocent and romantic age of the little girl, it is a period when she likes to listen to stories and is prone to fantasies. At the same time, she also has some expectations for the future. However, she still does not know the news that her father has died in battle. The name Renis seems to have some kind of curse. Her destiny today is not much stronger than that of the little queen more than 200 years ago. Cannot produce pity and sympathy. Because the little girl is only 3 or 4 years old now and has not received a very strict court etiquette education, she forgot that she should call Viceless uncle instead of calling him brother or calling him because of her age. Name. He can even kill a dragon bravely for me. The story of the dragon slayer has always been in biographical novels, and it is normal to have fantasy. And Rain stubbornly raised her small face, delicate chin, and even some pear blossoms with Rain. Speaking seriously about such unrealistic fantasy, it still makes people want to laugh. Viserys had an awkward but polite smile on his cheek. Gurululu, the wheels of the carriage kept rolling and making noises, and they were not far from driving out of King's Landing. While the chase sent by his father has not arrived yet, it seems that his father has also acquiesced to him to take Rhaenys away. After all, no matter what purpose the father detained Princess Ilyamart and her son for what purpose, but having more important people, one more girl or one little girl already seems irrelevant, let alone his granddaughter. Viserys has relaxed a lot, and then stretched out his hand to rub the brown hair of the little girl inherited from her mother, and didn't speak until the rubbing was a little messy. There are no more dragons in the world. Rhaenys. The last dragon has been dead for more than a century. While talking, Viserys looked at the Rhaenys hills in the distance, and said silently in his heart. If the Targaryen family still had dragons, it might not have fallen into this situation. Then, under the eye of the soldiers, 2 carriages with no family logo passed through King's Landing. Instead of walking through the more magnificent steel gate, they chose to make a circle and left King's Landing in a low-key manner through the Dragon Gate. A group of convoys set foot on Rosby Road and headed straight towards Mujok. Sir William decided to take a boat from Mujok to Dragon Rock Island. At the same time, a large ship also pulled anchor from the port of King's Landing as an option for confusion. The middle-aged coach has his own considerations. He knows that King's Landing and even the Red Fort have long been riddled with holes and spies have been planted in various ways. All the news is still being discussed among the former ministers in the throne hall in the morning, and it can circulate in the dirtiest flea dens in the afternoon. His Majesty Alice's move to transfer the guards of the Red Fort is not small. If the news of the transfer of the Queen and the Prince can be concealed, it will be a hell. So after careful consideration, Sir William made a confusing option. It is undoubtedly the best way to go straight to Longshadeo by boat from King's Landing, even if the recent sea storms are a bit dense. It is also a road to take a boat from Maguchang to Longshadeo by land. But now Westeros is torn apart and the rebels are all around. After leaving King's Landing, there may not be a place in the outside world that is truly safe. He actually took a certain risk when he decided to go overland. 7 gods are on top. Hung Bao teacher's rough fingers touched his brows and kneaded them lightly. They thought that the brows were the abode of the soul, so that sincere prayers would be heard by the gods. Hope everything is fine. Time is fast. 1 day later. After half a day of rushing yesterday and then taking a rest for the night, the team passed through Roshby City, continued walking on the Avenue of the King, and went straight to the port of Duzit Valley. There is the territory of the Lake family, and the loyal Earl rightfully guards the not-important port of Dust Wallow for His Majesty the King. Although the middle-aged teacher thought that Earl Rifle might not be reliable, but now that the general situation is gone, and the tide of defection has not yet made a decision, it is considered to be loyal to the King. Today's weather is a bit gloomy. The curtains of the carriage opened a little gap, and the light outside was a little dim. The patter of rain pounded on the roof of the car, and the road became muddy, and the carriage was a bit difficult to move, swaying from left to right. Viserys sat in the carriage and looked out the window. The trees on both sides of the road were shrouded in a hazy rain curtain. The cool breeze made his heart depressed. I always have a bad feeling. Sir William. The silver-haired boy sat on the seat, his eyes shifted from the outside scenery to the man directly opposite, while Rhaenys was sitting by his side with the cat in his arms. At this moment, the clever girl also understood that this is not a trip, otherwise the grandmother would not venture far away in such weather. Also in the carriage, Sir William Derry, who was sitting directly opposite Weselis, looked at the scene outside the window, and was silent for a moment. At this moment, he was already wearing his armor, with a long sword and a short spear on his waist. There is a bad news, but he doesn't know whether he should tell the prince. The big ship that set off from King's Landing with them was attacked by a group of unknown pirates before they left Blackwater Bay. Now I want to come has encountered an accident. This morning the soldiers from King's Landing rushed to bring the news, making him a little cold. Although he had known that the Red Fort was full of holes and leaks, this trip would inevitably be understood by the rebels, but he did not expect the rebels to move so fast. And as far as he knows, the coalition formed in the north, valleys, rivers, and storms do not have the upper hand in terms of ships. There are few sampans that can be launched, otherwise the Feng Shiveo will be blocked by the Qingting Island fleet. It will not be solved even now. Fortunately, he was cautious and did not choose a waterway that everyone thought was safe. Instead, he chose to hide the Queen and Prince in the carriage, airtight, and left King's Landing in a low-key manner. Now that the enemy must have known that Queen Layla and Vasilis did not take a boat to go by water. Your Highness, don't worry, the soldiers are ready to fight. Sir William sat in the carriage, pressing his sword hilt with one hand and said in a deep voice. However, I still need to go faster. Viserys did not know the bad news at sea, nor did he know what Sir William was thinking, but he still nodded. Compared to the soldiers outside, he was very satisfied to be able to sit in a carriage covered with soft fur. I see. Soon is another day at sunset. After a long day of trekking, coupled with the terrible weather today, light rain and pattering all day, the muddy road made everyone tired. And at this moment, the room leaked even night rain. The carriage that Queen Leela was riding in did not know if it was the cause of the stone bump, and it suddenly broke its axle. The horse wailed in pain and was almost pulled down. Fortunately, Sir William and a few soldiers caught it in time, untied the halter for it, and let it rest for a while. Queen Leela and her two maids got out of the carriage a little embarrassed, but fortunately, the light rain that had fallen all day stopped for a while at this time. However, there was a sudden change, and the team's forward movement could only be temporarily stopped. However, it just happens to be a time for everyone to rest. Sir William Yu reading www.yuyuganshu.com has repeatedly ordered to expedite the journey. The rest time has been reduced by half, and the strength of the soldiers and the horses is overwhelming. As the order for temporary repairs was delivered, everyone was slightly relieved. And Viselis also jumped off the carriage, and took the initiative to give up the intact carriage to his mother, who fell and was a little embarrassed. And he also came down to move his muscles and bones. Although riding a carriage is more comfortable than others, there are still some that can't be eaten in a day. And the roads in this era are not so smooth, and the carriages don't have excellent shock absorbers. Then he saw the middle-aged coach holding his sword hilt in one hand and stopping in front of the abandoned carriage. The silver-haired boy hesitated slightly, then walked up quickly. Sir William. Viserys spoke politely. Can I ask you about swordsmanship? William Derry, who was lowering his head in silence, did not expect that His Royal Highness would suddenly say such a thing. Was taken aback for a while. Why does your Highness have such an idea? This reminded the middle-aged teacher of the past 10 years ago. The teenager who was obsessed with reading and the harp suddenly found him in one day and told him, "Give me a sword and armor, it seems that I must be a warrior." And he really became one of the most skilled knights on the continent of Westeros. He is the elder brother of Viselis, Rhaega Targaryen. I'm 7 years old, and I'm old enough to be trained as a knight. However, the silver-haired boy raised his head and did not directly answer the instructor's question. And I will always use it in the future. Is not it? Since it was the request of the prince, the man with messy hair nodded and agreed without hesitating for too long. As Viselis said, it will always be used in the future. The current situation is not so good. He once taught Riga, and now he teaches Viceless. The brothers of the Targaryen family should call themselves teachers. This is something to be proud of. However, it is only a time to rest during the journey, and there are not many things he can teach. But whether for a knight on a horse to fight or a warrior on the ground, the most basic things will not change. The middle-aged coach only hesitated slightly, and then pulled out his saber from his waist with his backhand. The dazzling blade of the sword has some dazzling eyes, and the sound of the long sword being unsheathed is clear, attracting many soldiers who are resting, including the eyes of Queen Layla, who is sitting in the carriage and tidying up her clothes. Rhaenys is also looking at the window of the carriage. Looking at the silver-haired boy under a tree not far away. Weselis. Sir William is very tired, don't disturb him. Queen Leela, who was sitting in the carriage, frowned slightly, and then spoke softly with a slight worry. A pair of lavender eyes showed the figure of Veselis holding the heavy long sword swayingly. She is even more worried about whether Viceless will be injured. In fact, a sword is not very heavy, but it still requires a lot of physical strength to dance it easily. For a boy who is only 7 years old and has just passed the age of knight training, it still seems a bit difficult. And this is the basis of knight training. It's okay, Your Majesty the Queen. The middle-aged man with messy hair heard what Queen Layla said, turned his head and looked over, then leaned slightly and spoke. This is just a little toy, and every boy has to lift it in the end. Many soldiers sitting on the rocks and leaning on the tree laughed unanimously when they heard this. Yes, Your Majesty the Queen. As the guards in the Red Fort, they all knew that Queen Layla was a gentle and kind person. Without Queen Layla's blockade, they would not know how many people would be burned to death by her husband. William Derry has also been the coach of the Red Fort for many years. Even her eldest son Riga has been trained by this coach. Queen Layla hesitated slightly, and finally chose to keep her mouth shut. She believes that Sir William has a sense of measure and will not let Viserys be injured. And what he said is not wrong. In this era, as a boy, he is destined to lift up this small toy and work hard to protect his beloved relatives and friends. Then, the middle-aged coach looked down at the boy who was holding the long sword with difficulty, and his smile narrowed slightly. His Royal Highness, at your age you should have given you a wooden sword to practice. But now is a special time, I can only use my saber. As the head of the Red Fort, William Derry is very skilled and has taught many powerful warriors or knights. This is also the reason why Viserys took the initiative to ask him for advice. No one is better suited to teach him the ability to protect himself than William Derry. And Viceless nodded, listening to Sir William's words, and at the same time he was still trying hard to control the sword to prevent it from falling to the ground. The middle-aged coach saw Viserys's performance in his eyes, and nodded with some satisfaction in his heart. The 7 gods are on top. Viserys is not much inferior to his brother, at least in terms of attitude. Then he continued to speak, and at the same time drew a long sword from the waist of another soldier sitting next to him. Whether it is a spear, a gun, or a sword, this type of weapon has one of the best, easiest but most useful moves. The middle-aged coach looked at Viserys with a plain gaze, and then stabbed the long sword in his hand straight out. Because of the force, the sword stabbed out with the sound of breaking through the air. Learn to use the pointed end to stab the enemy. Fast, accurate, and ruthless. It can pierce the enemy's throat with a single blow. After the demonstration, the middle-aged coach took the sword and handed it to the soldier next to him, then turned his head and looked at Viceless. Have you learned, boy? Viserys nodded slightly. Is it easy? Then he continued to ask. He knows such children very well. When they first received training, they were very impetuous. He wanted to become the king of children within a few days and beat the world invincible. However, in fact, they want to be a good knight needs years or even decades of hard training. Such as the simplest stab, he is still practicing repeatedly now, striving to be the most extreme fast, accurate, and ruthless, instead of many tedious and complicated moves. Those are of no use except for their ornamental value. However, Viserys heard this question from Sir William while holding his sword, hesitated slightly, and then shook his head. He is not a child. This kind of problem is a pit at first sight. Of course he will not jump into the pit stupidly. He was educated for no reason, so Viserys spoke. It's not easy. Then you are wrong. Sir William opened his mouth and came, you read www.yuyuganshu.com and then suffocated his words again. He didn't expect Viserys to play the cards according to the plot, and choked him all at once. Am I wrong? Viserys tilted his head. Slightly puzzled. No, you are right. And Sir William patted his chest, pushed the breath back, and then spoke out of breath. Not far away. Rhaenys saw this scene by the window of the carriage, her beautiful eyes were bent into crescents, and she giggled without restraining her. She thinks Viserys must be deliberate. Then I saw the middle-aged man with messy hair patted Viserys on the shoulder and told him to practice a few times in accordance with the straight stab method. By the way, he exercised his wrist strength. Now Viserys is still slightly lifting the sword. It was a bit difficult and crooked. Then Sir William lifted his trousers and walked towards the edge of the woods not far away, wanting to make it easier, because there is a female family here, he needs to go farther. And at this moment, from the corner of his eyes, the middle-aged coach seemed to see a large swath of birds flying in the direction of Shallow, suddenly startled. The man stopped slightly and stood there, a bad premonition suddenly surged in his heart. At the same time, he also felt a slight tremor on the ground, and the sound of horseshoe running at high speed gradually sounded. Rumbling from far to near, it gradually enlarges, like rolling thunder. More soldiers who were sitting on the ground resting also reacted and took up their weapons one after another. Enemy attack! The soldier in charge of guarding also shouted loudly on the hill not far away. The gloomy sky is pressing on people's hearts, and it is an indispensable haze. The drizzle stopped slightly. And the enemy's attack was like a shower of rain and wind, horseshoes stomped on the ground, and the high sword and spear rushed towards the carriage protected by the guards in the center. All the enemies covered their faces with black cloth, and the family emblem on the armor was removed, which seemed to be deliberately concealing their identities. A knight headed by held a spear under his arm, and the sharp tip of the spear drooped slightly, shining with a sharp cold light aimed at the red fort guard in front. The black cloth wrapped his cheeks, only a pair of eyes were exposed, and a dull low roar sounded. Kill! Light! They! People! Is like thunder. Rumbling in the next second, the iron hoof rushes, whizzing. The purpose of these masked attackers is very clear. They just want to kill Layla and her son. And Queen Leela and her maids were stunned by the sudden attack, and they didn't even realize what happened. Enemy attack! Among them, the experienced Sir William was the first to react. But at this moment, he didn't have a long sword in his hand, he could only untie the short spear that he was good at using from his waist, aimed at the enemy rushing in the front, and then directly threw it out forcefully. The short spear broke through the air and burst into a sound. The knight headed by the masked attacker was caught off guard and was hit with a spear directly in the chest. The hard breastplate was not broken by the spear, but it was also smashed out of a deep pit. And because the masked rider did not clamp the horse with his legs, the powerful spear-throwing force disrupted the balance of the charge of the united man and horse, and the masked rider was directly overturned to the ground by this huge force. Plop! There was smoke and dust, and the masked rider was thrown to a halt, because his feet were entangled in the stirrups and the horses were forcibly dragged for a few meters before desperately breaking free. The cavalry behind him were also experienced, and discovered this sudden situation in time, bypassing the falling horse and continuing to charge forward. Otherwise, the unlucky knight will be trampled directly into the flesh by the ruthless iron hoof. And this raid on the avenue was also accompanied by this spear, which officially kicked off. Kill! The sound of fighting resounded in the avenue and the surrounding woods in an instant, like thunder. The guards of the Red Fort were just resting. They seemed to be caught off guard when they were attacked, and fell into the wind in an instant. A few soldiers were hit by the horse directly or had their throats slit before they stood up. Blood was sprayed, screams one after another, and some soldiers even dropped their weapons and went straight into the jungle in an attempt to escape. However, the masked rider who had just fallen off the horse has now struggled to get up from the ground. His leg seemed to be broken and he didn't know where the spear fell. He supported the ground with the scabbard of the saber, and stood up straight with a limping leg. There was a pair of eyes with unconcealable shame. Because the shame of falling a horse has been with him for half his life. He was defeated by a red-robed monk from Mill in a tournament group event held in King's Landing. The reason was that the red-robed monk used a burning sword to frighten his horse, so the noble knight shamefully thrown off by his own war horse. I didn't expect that he would fall off his horse again today, this time he seemed to have broken his leg. The masked lame knight stood on the spot with one hand holding the scabbard. The pain in his leg continued to flow up like a blunt knife, and the cold sweat on his forehead also leaked out. However, he just gritted his teeth and resisted the pain. His face remained as sharp as a falcon, and he still scanned the entire battlefield meticulously. He saw several Red Fort guards who were in charge of escorting the Queen and the Prince trying to escape, and then he waved his hand and pointed his finger to that side decisively and ordered. "Kill them all! Never let go!" Before the start of the Usurpers' War, the family did not express its attitude, drifting between the rebels and the Iron Throne. However, since the Battle of the Trident River, the heir of the royal family died in battle, and the situation gradually became clear. Targaryen was gone, and the family lost confidence in the Iron Throne. At the same time, he found the best time to intervene in the war and directly reap the fruits of victory in the war. And now the heads of Queen Layla and Prince Viserys are the best names to join the rebel camp. However, for various more important reasons, they still cannot directly reveal their identity. Therefore, with an order from the lame knight, several masked bandits were well trained and decisively freed from the battlefield. Rumbling. The horseshoe galloped up into the mud, and the masked attackers rode on war horses with blood-stained swords in their hands. Wow did not hesitate to urge the horse to separate the leaves of the weeds and dive into the woods. Strive to kill all the enemies, not keep alive, and keep all the news from being leaked out. Very good. The lame knight nodded with satisfaction when he saw this scene. Then the pain in his legs hit, and the muscles on his face twitched fiercely. Yukansha.com clenched the hilt of the sword to support his body. Although the king's army was corrupt, the guards of the Red Fort were still elite. When they encountered a surprise attack, they were caught off guard and fell directly into the wind. They suffered heavy losses in an instant, but when they reacted, they still broke out stubborn resistance. In an instant, under the leadership of the instructor of the Red Fort, several masked cavalry were directly picked off their horses, their heads were cut off with a sword, and blood spewed out like money. "Protect your Majesty the Queen." The middle-aged man with slightly curly hair was stained with blood, and he grabbed a horse and turned over and climbed up. Squatted on the horse's back, the horse galloped with a sword in one hand, and escaped the enemy's attack in the gap between the two horses. Immediately cut his throat directly with his superb swordsmanship. The war horse was frightened, and dragged the corpse on the horse back towards the woods. And Viserys, who is holding Sir William's sword, is still blank at the moment. He realized what had happened, but his legs stiffened in place as if lead was poured into him, and he watched the scene before him. The screams of screams, the splash of blood, the head that fell on the ground, all the powerful images made his breathing slightly stagnated. Then he saw a frightened war horse dragging an enemy's corpse into a rampage, rushing towards him. Viserys suddenly woke up in his brain at this time, because he knew that if he was hit by a horse, he might really die. Tried his best to overcome the fear in his heart, and the leaded legs seemed to suddenly have a trace of strength. Then when this frightened horse was about to hit him, jumped to the side. Viserys was a little embarrassed and rolled on the blood-stained avenue, and the blue velvet coat became dirty. The frightened warhorse whizzed past his ears, and the heavy horseshoe slammed on the ground, causing the stones to jump slightly. And His Royal Highness felt that his ears were about to be deafened, so he fell on his knees and curled up together. Hu was panting heavily with his hands on the ground, and his cheeks were hot and flushed. He wanted to say something about the rest of his life, but his fast-beating heart made his blood surge. However, the tense situation nowadays is ever-changing, and there is no room for him to feel any time. The sabre of Sir William landed on the ground not far away, stained with a little mud, but still shimmering with cold light. In the melee, the eardrums were filled with sounds of fighting everywhere, blood was splashing, and both sides had red eyes. And Viserys lay on the ground with both hands supporting the ground, panting heavily, raised his head and looked at the long sword that was slightly heavy for him not far away. Then I don't know where the courage and strength come from. Damn it! The silver-haired boy gritted his teeth and tried hard to get himself up, and then climbed up from the ground with difficulty, ignoring the heart that was about to jump out, and rushed over with a sigh of relief, and hugged it tightly. Cold touch. The sharp chill on the blade is almost solidified. Perhaps the former Viserys did not dare to hold such a long, narrow, and sharp weapon for fear of breaking the law or hurting himself, but at this time, he only felt that this sword was extremely cordial. Because in such a chaotic situation, everyone is overwhelmed by themselves, no one can protect him. Only himself. The silver-haired boy gritted his teeth slightly and swears secretly while holding the sword nervously. No matter who wants to kill himself, he will not catch him like a rabbit, even if he is dead, he will have to bite off his flesh. I will for sure. But while Viserys is cheering for himself, a robber who fell from his horse after his horse's leg was chopped off in the battle just now stood up with a sword in one hand and his head in the other. His leather armor was cut open with a hideous scar, and he was almost torn apart just now, but God's favor kept him from dying. When the robber stood up, under the broken leather armor, there was a touch of red and a golden lion logo. Flashed past. For various reasons. The red fort guard who had just cut off his horse's leg was killed by others in an instant. The battle was so fierce that he was not compensated. When he slowed down and pushed away his partner's body and got up from below, he shook his head and saw the boy standing in the blank area of the battlefield holding the sword. The iconic long silver gold hair, the lavender eyes are like gems, and the beautiful cheeks like a girl. The boy holding the sword also found him. Panic clearly appeared in a pair of eyes that were full of determination just now. Lost. Is like a scared rabbit. He didn't expect that he was still swearing secretly just now, but in an instant he was stared at by the enemy. And the masked robber who fell from the horse saw this unprotected big fish, his face slowly showed a grin, and the black cloth wrapped in his face was blown away by the wind. But he didn't care at all. Walked towards Viserys step by step with a long sword in his hand. A Targaryen prince without protection, like a fish on a chopping board. No matter how noble the boy's background is, how pure his bloodline is, the self I used to kneel on the ground is not enough to see the boy's toes. However, at this time, the noble origin and bloodline were not enough for the prince to avoid his own sword with mud legs. And Viserys didn't know if he was frightened and stupid or for other reasons, so he stood still and didn't move. Just breathe a little bit sharply, both hands clenched Sir William's sabre in his hand, and the tip of the sword pointed straight at the opponent. His brain was blank, just filled with the sentence that the middle-aged coach gave him. Learn to use the pointed end to stab the enemy. And behind Viserys invisible, a cloud of black mist gradually filled and rolled into an indescribable, a pair of scarlet eyes opened in the black mist, looking at his back. Viserys' eyes gradually smeared a layer of scarlet, his breathing gradually became heavier, and the sword was tightly held in his hand. And at this moment, between the electric light and flint, rumbling, the horse gallops. The horseshoe was rolled up with blood and mud. William Derry was covered with blood, not knowing whether it was he or the enemy, holding a long sword, and blood ticking down the blade. Then he lifted it high, and the horse galloped past the robber, and then the long sword traversed a path under the blood-red setting sun, severely chopped down. Next second, a big head flew directly, and then blood poured out like a fountain. The middle-aged man's long, slightly curly hair dyed blood looked a bit hideous. He had already red eyes, his legs were tightly clamped under the hip horse, and he immediately handed the long sword to his left hand. Step on. The horseshoe is walking on the blood mud. Yu reading www.yuuganshu.com. Then he bent over slightly as he passed Viserys, and put his body on the horse's back. Reached out his hand and hugged the little prince directly, placed it behind him, and said in a sharp voice, "Your Highness, hold me tight." The middle-aged coach discovered that Viserys was in danger at the most critical moment, and then hurriedly hurried his horse to slay the enemy with one sword, saving the little prince who was desperate to fight the enemy. While the enemy's hot blood spilled on the silver-haired boy's delicate cheeks, Viserys shuddered as if he was waking up from a dream. The black mist that was invisible to the people behind him also slowly dissipated, and the lavender jewel-like eyes became clear. His throat rolled slightly, and he clenched his teeth lightly. Then he realized what had just happened. He wants to fight the enemy hard? Where's the courage? However, he has been hugged by Sir William on horseback. Hearing what the coach said, Viserys hugged him decisively without hesitation. An enemy was chopped off his head less than 3 feet away, and blood was spilled on his cheeks, but Viserys didn't have any urge to vomit, or there was no chance to do so. Instead, he strengthened his courage and clenched his fists. Because he knows very well that if he wants to live, this is not the time for nausea and vomiting. The blood in the young body started to burn like it was ignited. For a 7-year-old boy, it's hard to say that he will be more brave than his performance. Kill! Immediately fought like a thunder from the knight's tongue, resounding once again on this blood-stained avenue. The setting sun is like blood. The battle is over, the air is full of disgusting smell, and the flat road is full of blood and mud. The rainwater and blood water mixed together and stuck to the boots of the middle-aged coach. Snap! Then he stepped on it staggeringly, splashed with water, and stayed in a small pit on the spot. The red rain quickly filled up. Stumbling did not go out a few steps, and then William Darry knelt down in the mud. With one hand resting on the ground, the sweat from his forehead seeps out continuously, and he opened his mouth and gasped for breath, like a fish thrown ashore. In his other hand is clutching his abdomen tightly, blood is still flowing from his fingers. He is hurt. This is the most serious injury on his whole body. A masked robber mortally counterattacked and stabbed him in the ribs with a sword. And there are many injuries left, large and small, even he himself can't remember. Not far away, the lame knight also drew his sword with difficulty and knocked down the last red fort guard who tried to kill him, and the long sword slammed on the opponent's neck. You! Damn it! Then he swiped down forcefully in the opponent's numb eyes, and blood spurted out instantly. The corpse's knees weakened and lost all strength, and then fell into the mud. The crippled knight killed the soldier, staggering slightly, and then used the sword pillar to stop his body on the ground with difficulty. The breastplate that was thrown out of a deep pit by a javelin undulated slightly, panting heavily, his golden hair and sweat stuck to his face. At this moment, the black cloth used to cover the face of the lame knight has long been lost. However, now he doesn't care anymore. The panicked shout was not far away, and the faint back figure was still looking backwards, and then went through the hills and into the woods, escaping without a trace. This was a fierce battle. Both sides had deserters who could not bear the pressure. They underestimated the morale and strength of the Red Fort guards, so they paid the price. When the battle entered a stalemate and it was obvious that the plan was impossible, the lame knight actually wanted to retreat. However, his broken leg was an obstacle to his escape. The deserters did not take away the adults who had obviously become cumbersome, but left him and fled. Now on the entire battlefield, in addition to a few men lying on the ground who were seriously injured and unable to escape, a few of the guards of the Red Fort were also leaning against the tree and wailing. Then, the Red Fort coach once again stood up with difficulty holding the sword. Only he and himself can stand up on the entire battlefield. The blonde lame knight's eyes were as sharp as a falcon and it was hard to say tired at the moment. He knew that since he was abandoned by his subordinates, it might be difficult for him to survive. Unless he can kill everyone here with one last breath, including Queen Lila hiding in the carriage shivering. At this moment, the crippled knight seemed to have thought of something. He was slightly dazed in front of him, and he held his forehead. Only then did he see that there was a boy with silver blonde hair standing beside William Derry. His body was also covered with mud and blood. He was holding a sword in his arms. It was he who helped Sir William. So there is another man here. The lame knight leaned on the sword and laughed blankly. Not far away. The slightly curly hair of the middle-aged teacher also clings to his cheeks, with one hand covering his ribs, and his eyes are dizzy. This is a sign of excessive blood loss. However, he still recognized who the mastermind of this attack was, and the black cloth on the face of the lame knight had been lost. Kayvon Lannister. It turned out to be you. The blonde lame knight's face looks a bit old, but in fact he is only in his 30s. Deep eye sockets, long decree lines, and a short trimmed golden beard on his chin, but he looks a little embarrassed at the moment. William's upper and lower lips trembled slightly. Of course he recognized who this person was before him. He is the younger brother of the famous Western Guardian Duke Tywin, and is now the uncle of James Lannister, who is with His Majesty the King. It turns out that Lannister has betrayed the Iron Throne. Sir William's voice was shocked. If the Lannister family has decided to betray the Iron Throne, then King's Landing might be really dangerous. Because before they set off, the Western Territory army had already marched towards King's Land under the banner of King Cheen. If King Iris II orders the gates to be opened and the Western army enters King's Landing, then this city that has never been attacked from the outside will probably fall from the inside. And there is a James Lannister beside His Majesty the King. Sir William. It's better for us to take a step back. And Kayvon Lannister didn't mind being recognized. Now his condition is very bad, and he can only beg for his life. Other things are not important. Kai Feng held the sword in one hand, and slightly raised the other hand, trying to make his language more sincere. There are few stunners in the Lannister family. Perhaps there are flexible genes in the bloodline. After all, everyone knows who Lannister's ancestors are. Now that he is stuck in such a rigid situation, Kai Feng did not give up his hope of survival. Yu reading www.yuyuganshu.com, but he didn't try to persuade the coach to surrender, because both sides knew that this was impossible. If the coach wanted to surrender, he could have done it long ago instead of fighting to such a degree. So he wants to take a step back. Don't look at the other side, there are Queen Leela, some maids, and a little boy. But Kai Feng has received strict training since he was a child, and he is proficient in combat. Several women and a boy pose no threat to him. He can kill these women and children one by one, even if he has a lame leg. The only threat to him is the Red Fort coach, who was seriously injured and far inferior to his own. Heard what the lame knight opposite Sir William called Kayvon Lannister said. Viserys was a little nervous in his heart, raised his head and looked at the man beside him. Impossible. However, Sir William put one hand on his ribs. His face was pale, but he flatly refused. It is impossible for him to let go of the opponent, otherwise he will wait until Kai Feng converges on the deserter. Then he looked at Viserys, who was standing next to him, and said, "Child, do you remember what I taught you just now? Learn to use the pointed end to stab the enemy." Viserys nodded heavily with his sword in his arms. "Follow me." Immediately, the middle-aged coach held the sword with one hand, staggering step by step towards Kai Feng. And Kai Feng knew that the opponent's attitude was resolute. He limped on one leg and couldn't run the other side. He also drew a long sword to fight. The two once noble sirs are now like two wounded hungry wolves, stumbling, rolling and killing in the rain and blood. Clang under the red sunset, the two long swords collided violently, and sparks burst out. The long sword that had been cut with the blade added an old scar, and Sir William's figure staggered and barely fell to the ground. And Kai Feng seized this opportunity, dragged a broken leg and rushed up, and used his other hand to punch the teacher's face heavily. The man with slightly curly hair was dizzy by the punch, with blood in his mouth, his teeth moved slightly, and he fell on his back to the ground. Die! And Kai Feng wanted to seize this opportunity to make up the knife, but he did not notice that William stumbled to the ground with force under his feet, and the long sword in his hand also fell out. The two men were covered in blood and mud, and the surrounding battlefield fell into silence at this moment. Only two people fisted to the flesh, and there was a faint groan from the mouth of the dying struggling person. The blood-colored sunset enveloped the entire avenue, and the breeze blew by and took away the rich smell in the air. It floated to the distance, and the scavenging birds in the sky circled in the sky, making a screaming cry. No one knew that such a fierce battle took place here. And Vasilis holding the long sword on the side finally seized the opportunity. Without hurting Sir William, penetrated through the gap in the armour from behind Kevon Lannister, and pierced in fiercely. Go to death! The silver golden-haired boy rushed over with the sword in his arms, and gave Kai Feng a chill. The sword tip penetrated the knight's chest without any hindrance and pierced out of the chest. The bright sword tip was dyed red with blood. Tick down along the tip of the sword. This knight from the Lannister family has experienced many battles. He once participated in the Battle of the 9 Bronze Plate Kings and made great achievements, but he did not expect that he would eventually die in the hands of a child. Then, the corpse lost all strength and fell to the ground with its knees. Viserys also panted and drew the long sword. What he didn't notice was that after he killed Kevon, a piece of black smoke that no one could see also followed his long sword and penetrated from Kevon into the palm of his hand. The warm current spread all over his body. Then the boy who drew his sword panted again and slashed it on Kevon's neck. He was afraid of not killing the opponent, and wanted to chop off Kevon's head directly. However, due to insufficient power, the long sword eventually got stuck in half of the corpse's neck. Blood overflowed and stained the whole land. And Kevon Lannister is already dead and can't die anymore. Viserys finally put down his sword at this time, and sat down on the ground, his chest rising and falling violently. From witnessing the battlefield up close to killing someone with a sword in person, he made rapid progress in order to survive and forced himself to run. While lying on the ground, Sir William, who was almost beaten to death by Kai Feng with his fist, had some bruises on his face at the moment, and his face was swollen, and he didn't even have the strength to sit up. "Child, why do you want to do this?" He watched Viserys's last crazy and cruel behavior. This only 7-year-old kid not only had the courage to kill the enemy, but also wanted to chop off the enemy's head. This highly contrasting picture shocked him slightly, and once again refreshed his impression of the second prince of Targaryen. Whenever a Targaryen is born, the gods will throw a coin to decide whether he is great or crazy. The instructor couldn't tell for a while whether it was a majestic posture or cruel madness. "I do not know either." And Viserys sat on the ground panting, glanced at Kevon's body, and saw the coat of arms exposed under the breastplate. Then he helped the middle-aged coach up. "Maybe I was just afraid that I didn't kill him." He didn't say anything about revenge, everyone would know what Lannister did afterwards, and he just charged a little interest now. And all the female relatives hiding in the carriage got out of the carriage at this time. No one blames them for not coming to help just now, because their skill may not have any effect, but it would be unhelpful. And at this moment, the sound of horseshoe galloping from afar came again. Weselis and Sir William's face all changed, but this time the direction of the sound of horseshoes was indeed where they were going. Next second, a group of cavalry holding flags appeared in their field of vision. The next day, it was close to dawn. A white diagonal cross on a blue background, and 2 crossed warmer flags flying. Rumbling, the gate of the brown fort opened, and Earl Rifley Lake was riding on the tall horse, wearing a black cloak and deerskin gloves, to personally greet him at the gate. "Your Majesty the Queen." While seeing Queen Layla's carriage arrived, Earl Rifley Lake got off his horse and led a large number of family members and servants to kneel down on one knee. They received a notice from King's Landing, so they set out to the Queen and the Prince to Mujok City. "However, I didn't expect it to come just right." Several deserters from the Red Fort were caught and received the news that the Queen had been attacked by robbers. Then Sir Jeremy Lake ordered to rush over and escorted Queen Layla and the Prince to the Brown Fort. The Brown Fort is the home of the Lake family. Reading www.ukanshu.com is located on the hills outside Magoo City, overlooking the whole Magoo City and the port. Sir William was seriously injured and was rescued urgently. He drank poppy milk after being carefully stitched up and bandaged by the Bachelor of Brown Fort, and fell asleep deeply at the moment. Queen Leela lives alone in a dormitory to rest. And Viserys is in the same room with the 2 little guys, Rhaenys. Step on. Silver gold long hair was slightly curled down his shoulders. Viserys returned to their bedroom holding Rhaenys, who had been terrified and fell asleep at the moment. I don't know why, he feels that his strength seems to be a lot bigger, and it doesn't take much effort to pick up Rhaenys. The little black cat Balerion also followed his owner, and it also survived that fierce battle. Viserys gently put the bed, the candle in the bedroom shook gently, and the sound of the armor on the soldiers outside was accompanied by the sound of patrolling footsteps. The Lake family does seem to be loyal, at least now. Viserys had some insomnia, perhaps after too much stimulation. The reality told him that it was not good to be in this world. Seems to be stuck in a quagmire. Even to survive, he needs to do his best. The boy stepped on a stool and lay on the narrow windowsill of the bedroom, looking at the scenery outside the window. Maguchang and the sea are divided into 2 halves. The sea is a bit quiet in the early morning, and waves are gently slapped on the reef. The salty and wet sea breeze blew in along the window, blowing on the boy's beautiful cheeks like a girl, and at the same time shook his silver golden hair. Viserys knows, this loyalty will not last long.